There were moments in your life when you felt yourself falling, and the ground seemed to rush up to meet you with terrifying speed. You cried out in the darkness, waiting for a hand to reach down and catch you, but the rescue never came. You hoped for a miracle, a sudden shift in the wind, or even just a small sign that you weren't alone, yet there was only a heavy, echoing silence. In those desperate hours, a single question likely took root in your heart. Where was God when I needed Him the most? This is a difficult conversation to have, but it is one that leads to true spiritual freedom, because your presence here today is proof that you survived what was meant to destroy you. If you have ever felt completely abandoned, ignored, or deeply confused by the silence of the divine, I want you to know that you haven't found this message by accident. There were seasons where you plummeted, waiting for a supernatural intervention to interrupt your pain or a miracle to change your trajectory, only to find that nothing happened. That silence didn't just pass, it stayed with you, becoming a weight you carried every day. Today, we are going to explore the profound mystery of why God watched you fall and chose not to stop it. It wasn't because He stopped caring or turned His back on you, but because a much greater work was happening beneath the surface. What felt like neglect in those moments was actually a form of divine precision. What felt like a painful distance was actually God positioning you for something you couldn't yet see. And what felt like a total loss was a silent preparation for your future. This isn't meant to be a simple, comforting explanation. It is a revelation of truth. Once you begin to perceive the why behind the silence, you will never be able to look at your past struggles in the same way again. I encourage you to stay with me until the very end, because one of these reasons may provide the exact answer you've been seeking regarding the timing of your life's greatest trials. Before we dive deeper into these truths, if you can already feel this message resonating with a deep part of your soul, please like this video to align your spirit with this perspective. Subscribe to our channel if you haven't already so you can stay connected to the messages designed for your unique path. I also invite you to comment 99 below. Spiritually, the number 9 represents divine completion, and 99 serves as a powerful confirmation that a cycle God allowed in your life has finally closed, and a much higher, more purposeful chapter is now opening up for you to walk into. Think back to a time when you honestly believed you had everything under control. It wasn't necessarily coming from a place of arrogance or pride. It was much more subtle than that. You were careful with your plans, you thought through every possible scenario, and you learned how to survive without ever having to ask for help. You became incredibly efficient at carrying the weight of the world on your own shoulders. This is precisely why the fall was permitted to happen. Control doesn't always look like vanity. Often, it looks like being the responsible one, the strong one, or the person who never lets anyone down. While you thought you were trusting in a higher power, something had quietly shifted in your heart. Without realizing it, you had begun to trust your own ability to endure hardship more than God's ability to intervene on your behalf. You were leaning on your own intelligence and preparation, rather than seeking divine direction. God watched this happen and chose not to interrupt the process. If He had stepped in too early to save you, the illusion of your self-sufficiency would have remained intact. You would have continued to believe that as long as you worked hard enough, you could protect yourself from any collapse. However, there are certain depths of faith that simply cannot be reached through human strategy or clever planning. There are encounters with the divine that only occur when your personal systems fail and your backup plans finally crumble. The fall wasn't a sign of God withdrawing His support from you. It was actually God removing the false floor you had been standing on for years. You might have noticed that when you fell, it wasn't just one thing that broke. Multiple areas of your life shook at the exact same time. This is because God wasn't targeting a specific situation. He was targeting a mindset. He was challenging the deep-seated belief that you were the one holding everything together. He allowed things to fall apart to prove a shocking and beautiful truth, that even when everything collapsed, you were still here. The illusion of control shattered, but your existence remained. That was the core revelation of your trial. You were never the one holding it all together. You were actually being held the entire time. It was only after you hit the ground that you began to feel a different kind of strength. Not an adrenaline rush, but a quiet, steady power that comes from total surrender. You started to understand that God's power doesn't necessarily activate when you are at your most capable. It activates when you make yourself available. It begins when you stop trying to manage every outcome and start yielding to a higher direction. This is why the fall had to be as significant as it was. If your control hadn't been broken, your trust could never have matured. Once this illusion is gone, you can never go back to being the person you were before. You don't approach decisions with the same frantic energy, and you don't grip your life quite so tightly anymore. This shift in your perspective is only the beginning of your transformation. When God removes something from your life, it is never the last thing He plans to do. Something much deeper was activated within you during that period of falling, even if it hasn't fully revealed itself yet. The silence you experienced wasn't just between you and heaven, it was felt in your earthly relationships as well. When you fell, it wasn't just the divine that seemed quiet. It felt like the people around you went silent too. The messages stopped coming, the invitations dried up, and familiar voices drifted away. That silence from others hurt in a unique way because you weren't just processing the pain of the fall. You were processing the shock of who disappeared the moment you weren't standing strong. God did not rush to fill that empty space, and that was intentional. There are certain truths about loyalty and alignment that can only surface when comfort and convenience are stripped away. The fall created a necessary pause in your life, and in that stillness, every relationship you had was tested without a single word being spoken. Some people didn't leave with a bang, they just quietly drifted away. God stayed silent during this time because this exposure of character could not be forced. If He had fixed things too quickly, the masks people were wearing would have stayed on. People would have continued to show up for the version of you that benefited them, rather than the version of you that was being forged in the fire. It is difficult to accept, but God wasn't just showing you who other people were. He was showing you who you were. You began to notice who you were chasing for validation and who you were afraid to disappoint. In that newfound awareness, you realized how much of your identity was tied to being needed or admired. The fall stripped those layers away and asked a very hard question. Who stays when you have nothing to offer but your honesty? Who listens when you aren't being productive or impressive? The answers to those questions reshaped your inner world. What remained after the fall felt different. There were fewer voices, but they were clearer. There were fewer connections, but they were deeply aligned. This reduction wasn't a loss. It was a divine form of protection. Carrying people who were only assigned to your old season would have only served to slow you down in the next one. Some relationships were never designed to survive your transformation. They were built around who you were when you were carrying everyone else, not who you were becoming once you stopped. The same fall that removed the wrong people also refined your sense of discernment. You no longer mistake proximity for loyalty, and you don't confuse familiarity with true safety. You have learned to feel the energy of a situation before any words are even spoken. This heightened awareness was born in the silence that God allowed. He knew that where He is taking you next, having the wrong connections would be far more dangerous than experiencing a season of loneliness. As the tension rises, you realize that the next thing God allowed to die during your fall wasn't something external. It was something inside you. What truly fell wasn't just your stability or your confidence. It was a version of yourself that could not survive in the future you are headed toward. This part of the journey is often the most uncomfortable. The version of you that had to die wasn't bad or broken. It was just familiar. It was the identity that kept you safe by teaching you how to adapt instead of how to confront. It was the part of you that chose peace over truth because the truth felt too expensive. It was the version that knew when to shrink and when to tolerate things that were slowly draining your spirit. God allowed that version to fall because it had reached its expiration date. Those old habits may have helped you survive past chaos, but they weren't designed to handle your future expansion. God watched you fall because most of us refuse to let go of our old selves unless we are forced to. You wouldn't have released that identity voluntarily because it worked for a long time. It kept things predictable and kept you accepted by others. That is why the fall had to be severe enough to make staying the same more painful than changing. It wasn't a random accident. It was a controlled demolition of structures that could no longer be renovated. After the fall, the disorientation you felt wasn't a sign of failure. It was the space where something brand new was being formed. God wasn't erasing who you are. He was separating your true essence from your survival instincts. Everything you did out of fear or necessity was exposed so it could finally be released. In its place, a more powerful version of you began to surface. One with clear boundaries and a voice that no longer asks for permission to exist. You might have felt a deep grief for the person you used to be, but that old version simply couldn't go where you are going. The ground you hit didn't destroy you. It marked the place where the old identity lost its power. There is a kind of protection that feels warm and comforting, but there is another kind that feels unsettling yet becomes permanent. God withheld a quick rescue because you were ready for that second kind of protection, discernment. If He had stepped in every time you were in trouble, you would have remained dependent on Him for constant intervention instead of developing your own spiritual perception. Rescue removes you from harm, but discernment prevents you from walking into it in the first place. The fall was the classroom where you learned to read the atmosphere of your life. Your awareness sharpened in ways that success could never teach. You started sensing when intentions were misaligned or when words didn't match the weight they carried. That wasn't paranoia. It was your perception being activated under pressure. This wisdom was expensive because discernment is born through experience, not just through hearing a lecture. You had to feel what it was like to ignore your intuition so that you would never do it again. God allowed the fall to imprint this wisdom into your very nervous system, turning it into an internal compass that will never expire. Now, as you move forward, you no longer just listen to promises. You measure consistency. You don't just pray for protection. You move differently in the world. This discernment might feel isolating at first because you can see things that others still choose to tolerate, but it is a necessary shield for the level you are approaching. God stayed silent because saving you too early would have kept you naive, and naivety is dangerous in the season ahead. Once this wisdom is activated, God begins to trust you with more responsibility, which brings us to the final reason for the silence. Pride often hides in the most dependable people, the ones everyone leans on. God watched you fall because there was a subtle form of pride that was limiting your capacity to receive grace. You were strong, but you were guarded. You knew how to lead and how to give, but you didn't know how to be held. Humility isn't about thinking poorly of yourself. It's about removing the armor that prevents grace from reaching you. The fall cracked that armor. It made you real. It showed you that you are worthy even when you are at your weakest. The fall didn't reduce your value. It recalibrated your heart. It removed the need to prove yourself and allowed grace to operate freely in your life. But even this humility wasn't the final goal. It was the preparation for a greater assignment. Your survival was never just about your personal growth. It was about the people who will one day need to hear your story. God allowed the fall because some truths can only be spoken with authority by someone who has been on the ground and lived to tell about it. Your pain has given your voice a resonance that people recognize as authentic. You are still standing today because you were never meant to stay down. You were meant to rise with a new level of vision and authority that only the fire of trial can produce. From this moment on, don't walk as someone who barely escaped their past. Walk as someone who was shaped by it on purpose. If this truth has ignited a fire in your spirit, don't keep it to yourself. Comment, "I rise different," to declare that your fall no longer defines you. Remember, God didn't save you from the fall because He was busy preparing you for everything that comes after it.